Bom dia a todos e todas. Então, podemos começar nosso webinar. Primeiro, então, queria dar as boas-vindas a todos que estão participando hoje deste nosso segundo webinar da Sociedade Brasileira de Gerontecnologia, sobre o tema os impactos da pandemia na sociedade, envelhecimento, questões postas. Sabemos muito bem que os efeitos causados pelo Covid-19 são especialmente perigosos para as pessoas idosas. Agora, o que significa isso para as sociedades envelhecidas ou em fase de envelhecimento? Preocupações em relação à imagem das pessoas idosas já foram apontadas em um recente artigo da professora teve e do professor Jorge Félix. Por isso, a Sociedade Brasileira de Gerontecnologia está realizando, junto com o Instituto de Envelhecimento Populacional da Universidade de Oxford, Inglaterra, e com a Rede Latino-Americana de Pesquisa sobre Envelhecimento, LARNA, este webinar. Nós temos o grande prazer de poder contar com dois colegas colaboradores já em outros eventos do Instituto sobre Envelhecimento Populacional da Universidade de Oxford, Inglaterra. O professor Dr. George Leeson e o professor Dr. Alejandro Klein. Então, vamos agora começar primeiro com a fala do Dr. Leeson, só para rapidamente apresentar o contexto dele. Dr. Leeson é diretor do Oxford Institute of Population Aging, University of Oxford. O campus de pesquisa do Dr. Leeson são aspectos sociodemográficos do envelhecimento. Os focos atuais são as desigualdades demográficas do envelhecimento global, as mudanças populacionais na Europa e América Latina, migrações na Europa. Então, vamos agora ouvir o professor Leeson vai falar em inglês, como já foi anunciado, não tem tradução, então vamos agora acompanhar. Nós vamos fazer da seguinte forma, que os dois palestrantes vão falar e depois podemos abrir para algumas perguntas que podem ser feitas de forma escrita. Nós vamos talvez ter, dependendo do tempo, 2 ou 3 perguntas que podemos responder. Então, agora, vou passar para o professor Leeson. Muito obrigado por estar hoje de manhã conosco. Então, agora, com tudo com o senhor. Professor Leeson, please, thank you very much for being with us this morning. And I have presented you and the idea of our meeting, and so I will directly pass to you. So we want to hear from you about this if the ageism been boosted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Please, with you.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. I hope the sound and the technology is all working adequately. And so let me begin by thanking my colleagues, Alejandro Klein and Gala da Silva, and also Johannes for hosting and arranging the webinar. And of course, I'm very pleased to be able to contribute in this strange time for all of us when we are unable to get together physically. At least we are able to get together in the virtual world and share our thoughts and our research. And particularly with the COVID-19 pandemic, I think a lot of issues have been raised around the world in many countries, issues which are particularly important and pertinent to older people, and therefore to those of us who work with and for older people in our respective countries and doing our different sorts of research. One thing that has struck me in particular during the pandemic is what I would call an increasing ageism. And I find this particularly disturbing. Let me give you a little bit of background to my own interest in ageism, in age discrimination. So my first research into age discrimination is probably about 30 years ago now, looking at the age-determined barriers to people's participation in various aspects of life. In particular, we were interested at looking at the barriers, the age barriers to people's participation in education, in the workplace, but also in other cultural environments. And it was striking at the time to discover how random these age barriers were. So that if you were, for example, a ballet dancer, the age barrier for continuing to perform at a high level as a ballet dancer is very, very young. It's in, so this was in Europe, and the age barrier was in the 30s. So if you were 39, I'm afraid you had to give up as a ballet dancer. There was no real rationale for any of these age barriers that prevented people, both young and old, from participating in the workplace, in education, and in other activities. And it was the randomness of the barriers that I think were striking. And of course, the barriers were based on chronological age. And that chronological age, which acted as a barrier to participation, was also a signal that those beyond that age, if we think of older age groups, that those beyond that age were now old and could not participate. And that's a really important thing to happen on the basis of a birthday. There's a history, of course, to why these ages, random though they may be, why they existed. And there is a history around defining a social space for older people, and there's a history around defining this chronological age, which has a statistical origin, going back to a Belgian statistician who believed that every event in life could be linked to a probability. And because of these statistical models, we ended up with an age. So we defined when someone was old. We had constructed social spaces where older people were kept, if you like. And then perhaps more importantly, we experienced the arrival of geriatric medicine. And geriatric medicine was very important and very instrumental in defining old age and older people. And again, it was all linked into a chronological age. The final thing that defined this group was, of course, the introduction of pension schemes, so that when one did leave the workplace on the grounds of age, you received a pension. Many of these were state funded to begin with. In other words, we had a wonderful construction, which meant this group of people could be placed in this box and defined as old people. Once we had them there, it was very easy to discriminate against them. And as I say, 35 years ago, I began to look at these age barriers and this age discrimination, which was particularly significant across Europe, but also across North America. And various governments, the American government was one of the first to introduce age discrimination legislation, so that age was no longer permissible as a marker of when you should leave the workplace. Other countries followed suit. And in Europe, the European Union worked on what is formally called directives, because the European Union doesn't produce legislation as such, but directives which governments are then expected to implement within their own judicial and parliamentary systems. And so slowly anti-age discrimination legislation was introduced across Europe. The United Kingdom, where I am based, I think I'm right in saying the United Kingdom was the last of the European Union countries to introduce the age discrimination legislation. And it's been in place now for around about 10 years or so. But what is interesting to note, and I've been working on this since, what is interesting to note is that the age discrimination practices still exist, despite the fact that we have age discrimination legislation, which prevents age being used as a determinant of what you are and are not allowed to do. And therefore it's particularly, it's a particular concern, I think, that during COVID, we have seen ageism come up to the surface again. We have a saying in English, and it's called "out with the old and in with the new." I don't know whether that will translate well at all, and it's something we actually usually talk about at New Year, when we celebrate a new year on the 31st of December, 1st of January. We talk about out with the old, in with the new, beginning something new. And I think that in these COVID times, and what we are approaching hopefully soon, which will be the post-COVID time, that particular saying, out with the old, in with the new, has taken something of a sinister twist. I think we keep experiencing ageism. And it's very often something which is, people will say, oh, it's not intentional, it's not meant to be ageist, and almost a throwaway comment in a newspaper, or a throwaway comment from a politician. And I can never help thinking here in 2020, why are we still hearing these ageist comments? Why do we have any isms left in our societies as we are in the third decade of the 21st century? As we literally stumbled into the COVID-19 pandemic, and some countries stumbled clearly more than others into the pandemic, it became very clear from the statistics, from the data, that this was a virus which killed predominantly, but not exclusively, older people. And all of the data that we have seen in the media and from governments have focused very much on the fact that older people were particularly vulnerable to COVID. And certainly across Europe, and I'm sure across your countries in Latin America too, we've had very depressing stories, tragic stories of families unable to be with their older loved ones at the end of their lives, families unable to visit confused, frightened, older family members who are living in care homes. COVID hasn't been nice to us in any way, but it did, for a time, I think, suggest there was a hope, a suggestion that we might begin to adopt a new way of life because of COVID. Even perhaps that we would begin to think very differently about a whole range of issues in our lives. Unfortunately, it's then that we begin to see the ageism coming to the surface again. And I will use a couple of examples from the last few months during the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly here from the UK. So as we got deeper and deeper into the COVID crisis, and moved into the stage of the crisis where people began to talk about returning to some sort of normality, some of the headlines we would see said things like, from now, policies must put young people first. And the fact that older people's pensions have been secured and protected was questioned, whether that should be allowed to continue in the post-COVID era, when governments would need to start rebuilding broken economies. We heard statements like, younger generations have accepted extraordinary constraints to protect us, older people, from coronavirus. So that the old people might be dying, but the younger people are making the sacrifices and the constraints of lockdown, where we weren't allowed to leave our homes, we weren't allowed to go shopping, we weren't allowed to visit friends and family. This was seen as a sacrifice for younger generations and something that they now needed to be rewarded for. And there has been some criticism then of the guarantee for state pensions to follow wage increases or rates of inflation or whatever. This is particularly alarming because certainly in the UK, the state pension is very modest, and even a small percentage increase of that is a tiny amount of money extra put into the hands of old age pensioners. The earnings of many people, in fairness, have been affected quite dramatically by the COVID impact on the economy, while the pension, because of its guarantee, has been able to increase, but by 2.5%. 2.5%. And 2.5% of a very little amount is a very small increase. But we're not talking about huge increases in pensions. But there is much muddiness around the arguments. There is a lot of greyness. And that leaves older people open to attack. We've seen claims that there will be very high unemployment as we leave COVID behind, due to the economic shock that has been caused by the lockdown. And this lockdown had one purpose, and that was to save the lives of older people. And that is now being turned into an argument against older people. And some have claimed that if we had looked at the mortality rates among young families, that would never have justified such a drastic lockdown. So the whole lockdown was to save older people. That is the hypothesis, that is the claim. So if we begin to look at this argument, I mean, I think I would ask, my first question would be, well, where should we begin here? Because across the globe, older people are dying in their hundreds of thousands, in our hospitals, in our care homes, and in our communities. Therefore, I wonder how many lives of older people actually have been saved by the lockdown, or whether the lockdown really hasn't worked in moderating the death rate. One can't help thinking that somewhere in this argument, this hypothesis, there's a feeling that some lives are worth more than others, and that the lives of older people are worth less than the lives of younger people. It's also something which many economists have used in the past in looking at QALY years to determine whether or not certain surgical procedures should be carried out on older people, or should they be carried out on younger people. But we have to ask, where is this unfairness? And why do we want to stoke this unfairness and this generational conflict, when really, I think COVID should have taught us one thing, as that is that generations need to come together and families need to come together. Perhaps retirement needs to be revisited, and perhaps old age needs to be revisited. Maybe it's time to ask whether 65 really is an acceptable definition of old age. Certainly gerontologists have moved away from chronological age as a defining concept for old age, and we talk about biological age and social age, etc., etc. I think the fact that our older people in care homes in particular have been left very much unprotected, and I think the fact that the social care workers looking after older people have been left very much unprotected is a very stark and worrying indication of the value that we don't place on older people. And rather than COVID taking us into some new world where we look at things differently, including older people and the way they live their lives, it would seem almost that those ageist views, ageist policies are still firmly embedded in different countries around the world. And if I had one message, it would be to say that it has to stop. Enough is enough. And we have to stop putting the generations to war, but we have to bring the generations together to work. And with that, I will close, and I'm happy to take whatever happens now. I'm not quite sure what will happen now.
Well, Mr. Delissen, thank you very much for your inspiring and recuperating observations. I will give some ideas to our Brazilian public. O Dr. Delissen apontou os problemas que estão acontecendo no contexto do Covid, que muitas vezes a reclusão das pessoas idosas e dos jovens foi entendido como um sacrifício dos jovens em relação aos idosos, e aí toda esta relação com as aposentadorias que continuam enquanto os jovens ficam desempregados, estão perdendo dinheiro, pode reforçar um conflito entre as gerações. E este vai ser um grande desafio para o futuro, de nós tocarmos para frente esta relação, não como conflito, mas para juntar as gerações. Isso muito rapidamente, algumas ideias básicas. Thank you very much, Dr. Delissen.